They used to drop bombs. Now they drop corn. That's not a metaphor. That's not a slogan. That is exactly what happened in Burkina Faso in 2025. For decades, military helicopters in the Sahel meant fear, fire, and funerals. But one order. Just one turned machines of death into messengers of life. 100 tons of corn seeds rained from the sky like a golden storm over cracked soil that had forgotten what green looked like. Children screamed, not from terror, but joy as kernels poured from the heavens. Villagers beat drums, as if a war had ended. But this wasn't charity. It wasn't aid. It was power redefined. Because the man behind it wasn't a donor. He was a soldier, a captain, a president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. And the question that echoed across Africa was simple. Could seeds dropped from the sky grow more than crops? Could they grow freedom? The skies over Burkina Faso had long been a place of warning. For too many years, when villagers looked up and saw helicopters, they braced for disaster airstrikes, evacuations, or the arrival of foreign aid stamped with flags they didn't recognize. The sky never belonged to them. Until 2025, that dry season, something unbelievable happened. The same choppers once used to silence protest, to protect mines controlled by outsiders, or to patrol. Hungry borders were now loaded with sacks of corn. Not guns, not fuel, just seeds. 100 tons of maize, lifted into the air. Not for war, but for life. It was President Ibrahim Traoré, Captain Ibrahim latest news, who issued the order, dressed in his signature red beret. He stood before the military elite in Ouagadougou and stunned them. No more waiting for donors. No more praying for trucks from Geneva. This time, he said, we fly with our own hands and we drop what our people truly need. Within hours, the nation was mobilized. Civilian pilots volunteered. Military squadrons were reassigned. Airfields that once sent soldiers to fight now sent seeds to grow. Villagers gathered in clusters across the savannah, unsure if the rumble above was another threat or something else. Then it began. Golden streaks fell from the sky. Kernels rained like a second sun. Children ran with baskets, laughing, scooping up the blessings. Elders wept openly. Some danced, some prayed. Some simply stood in awe. One farmer later told a local journalist, I thought I was dreaming. For once, the sky gave instead of taking. It wasn't just symbolic, it was surgical. Helicopters flew low and slow, blanketing fallow lands with precision. Entire fields were seeded in minutes, reaching corners aid trucks hadn't touched in years. Areas long written off as barren began to change. And then something miraculous happened. The rains came early. It wasn't supposed to rain that month. But within 2 weeks, the first drops tapped the earth, gently, as if nature itself was listening. The cracked, wounded soil of the Sahel responded. Shoots appeared. Green streaks began carving through the dust. Satellite images from international weather agencies caught it first odd lines of green slicing through browns and greys. At first, they thought it was a glitch. It wasn't. It was hope, blooming in real time. Within a month, the Ministry of Agriculture released the first results. Germination rates were nearly 40% higher than predicted. Entire families that once rationed handfuls of millet were roasting fresh corn under starlit skies. Women ground kernels into flour for morning porridge. Goats and cattle grazed on lush stalks. Young men returned from cities to tend land they thought had died. In one village, the local radio broadcast a simple line, "The earth has remembered us." The miracle wasn't just in what grew, it was in what no longer had to die. Malnutrition dropped in just a single season. Children once fed with powdered imports now chewed roasted corn off the cob, their laughter echoing across fields that had once been silent. It was more than a harvest. It was a resurrection. And yet, this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Because while the fields were turning green, something deeper was taking root, something no helicopter could carry. Belief. Belief that a nation could feed itself without permission. That power didn't have to arrive in envelopes or with soldiers. That maybe, just maybe, Africa's story didn't have to begin with suffering. But behind the beauty, the question loomed. What if the rains didn't return next year? What if pests came? What if the world hated a self-reliant Africa? Those questions would come. The enemies would come. But for that moment, for that season, the skies belonged to the people, and the seeds of sovereignty had touched the soil. When the corn began to grow, many called it a miracle. But for Ibrahim Traoré, it wasn't magic. It was math. It was memory. It was a map to sovereignty. This wasn't about corn. This was about control. For decades, Burkina Faso had been trapped in a vicious cycle. Drought leads to famine. Famine leads to dependency. And dependency leads to silence. Silence when their gold was taken. Silence when their children starved. Silence when foreign experts arrived with charts and conditions and contracts wrapped in smiles. Traoré knew the soil held more than hunger. It held history. So he asked a question his predecessors feared. What if we fed ourselves first? Critics scoffed. Western economists called it reckless. NGOs muttered about logistics. Even African leaders whispered that it was too bold, too fast, too dangerous. But Traoré, Captain Ibrahim, latest news was never one for whispers. He was a soldier. He understood that sometimes the greatest strategy is speed. And corn. Corn was the perfect weapon. It was no accident that maize was chosen. Across Africa, maize had silently become the continent's most adaptable crop. It didn't need perfect soil. It didn't beg for steady rain. It fed goats, chickens, children, and hope. You could turn it into porridge, flour, oil, even fuel. It was food. It was income. It was freedom in a kernel. And helicopters. That was no accident either. Land reforms take years. Irrigation demands loans. Traditional distribution systems were corrupt. Grain sacks disappearing before they reached farmers. Traoré skipped it all. He weaponized the air. In 1 week, more seed hit the ground than in an entire year of foreign-backed projects. No middlemen, no contracts, just flight paths and precision. Observers were stunned. UN officials called it logistically unprecedented. Journalists ran headlines about the corn commander. Some called it chaos. Others saw genius. In villages, it didn't matter what they called it. What mattered was that the soil responded, and so did the people. Because this wasn't just an agricultural decision, it was a psychological war. For too long, African skies brought pain. Military raids, foreign aid, or empty clouds. Now, the skies were generous. For the first time, when villagers looked up, they saw themselves, their machines, their seeds, their destiny. It was called the Reign of Hope. And it worked. Within months, the Ministry of Agriculture confirmed a germination rate beyond 60%. That was unheard of. Malnutrition dropped by nearly a third in zones where the seed reigned. Clinics saw fewer children with bloated stomachs, fewer mothers begging for powdered milk. But with success came fear. International aid agencies grew nervous. Their grip was slipping. Western grain lobbyists worried about competition. Environmental NGOs warned of monoculture and soil degradation. Every success from the fields brought a new storm from the boardrooms. Traoré faced it head-on. He reminded his people, they said it was madness when we took back our gold. They said it was madness when we kicked out the exploiters. And now, they say it's madness when we feed our own children. And maybe they're right. He smiled. Maybe madness is exactly what we need to break the chains. In a country once defined by foreign donations, the power of planting became revolutionary. Communities built makeshift fences to protect crops. Villagers organized watch groups to prevent overgrazing. Elders created shift schedules for grazing herds. They weren't waiting for trucks. They were protecting their own harvest. And in that protection, something rare happened in the Sahel. Ownership. One elder in the province of Fada Ngorma said it best. We used to guard aid trucks like gold. Now we guard our own fields. That's how you know something has changed. Yes, there were still challenges. Rains could fail. Pests could come. But for now, the rhythm had shifted. Hunger was no longer fate. It was a challenge they could meet with their own hands, on their own land. So the next time someone called it madness, an old farmer responded simply, "If madness means my grandchildren eat, then may we all go mad." And across Burkina Faso, belief spread faster than corn ever could. Success has a price. And in Africa, that price is often betrayal. Just as the cornfields of Burkina Faso turned golden, storm clouds gathered, not in the sky, but in Brussels. Washington, and Geneva. The moment the Sahel rose to feed itself, the old powers moved to shut it down. It began quietly. Whispers in trade corridors, memos passed between European agriculture ministers. Reports suddenly surfaced warning that Burkina maize posed a risk to market stability. The claim, the corn hadn't been certified. Its facilities weren't compliant. The quality might threaten European consumers. On paper, it looked like protocol. In truth, it was panic, because for the first time, a poor African nation had disrupted a billion-dollar system. For decades, Western agribusiness had dumped cheap, subsidized grain onto African markets, crippling local farmers. Now, Burkina Faso latest news showed a nation exporting, not begging, and that terrified them. Investigative reporters in Paris uncovered the truth. Powerful grain lobbies had pushed for restrictions. Multinational food giants offered to buy Burkina surplus dirt cheap, only to rebrand it and resell it abroad. When Traoré refused, demanding that processing and profits stay in African hands, they pulled the alarm. Trade officials in Brussels drafted quiet bans, certification delays, safety concerns. One leaked document admitted the real motive: rapid surplus from Burkina Faso may undermine EU market confidence. They weren't protecting consumers. They were protecting control. Traoré knew it, and he said it loud and clear. Standing before thousands in Ouagadougou, he thundered, "They didn't care when we were hungry. Now they're terrified we might feed ourselves. What they fear is not our corn. What they fear is our independence." The crowd erupted, but behind the applause, worry grew. What would happen to the harvest already piled in silos? Would farmers be forced to watch their grain rot while trade doors stayed closed? One agricultural cooperative leader put it plainly: first they sell us powdered milk and call it aid, now we offer them maize, and they call it a threat. It was colonialism dressed in paperwork. But Traoré didn't fold. Instead, he turned east and south. In 2026, Burkina Faso signed historic grain deals with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Long-term, multi-million-dollar contracts. Soon after, India and China expressed interest, not just in corn, but in ethanol produced from Burkina maize. The surplus became leverage. What Europe rejected, the world embraced. By the second harvest, maize production reached nearly 5 million tons, with 40% available for export. Revenues crossed $1 billion. That wasn't just money, that was proof. And yet, criticism didn't stop. Western think tanks called it unsustainable. Environmental NGOs warned of soil exhaustion, monoculture, and agricultural populism. One European analyst sneered, "A helicopter may scatter seeds, but it cannot scatter stability." Traoré answered with numbers. Soil studies showed crop rotation already underway, with beans and groundnuts restoring nitrogen. Corn stalks were used for compost and animal feed. Revenues funded irrigation, storage, and training. The plan wasn't chaos. It was strategy rooted in science, scaled by sovereignty. And the people, they stood firm. Women's cooperatives led the charge. In towns like Kaya and Bobo Dioulasso, women proudly sold made in Faso flour, oil, and snacks. They built schools with profits, funded clinics, launched microloans. They said it was madness. One woman told reporters, "But madness is what gave us dignity." And across the country, youth stopped fleeing. Boys who once dreamed of the Mediterranean now stayed to work silos and mills. Girls once denied school now ran village bakeries. A new economy was rising, not imported, but grown. Still, the pressure mounted. As profits rose, so did threats. Farmers reported middlemen offering bribes to sell low. Rumors swirled of sabotage of pest infestations, crop fires. Nothing confirmed, but everyone knew. The world doesn't let Africa rise quietly. So the people organized. They built patrols, fortified silos, monitored fields with donated drones. Farmers became guardians, not just of crops, but of a new identity. Because by now, it was clear. This was no longer just about maize. It was about memory, about justice, about a continent daring to break the script. And if you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. When the world closed its doors, Burkina Faso built new ones, denied access to European markets, undercut by foreign grain lobbies, and slandered as unstable. The country could have crumbled, but it didn't. It adapted. And what came next was not just resistance, it was reinvention. The numbers spoke louder than any politician. By 2027, maize production had surged past 8 million tons. But the real story wasn't in the harvest. It was in the hands that shaped it. In towns once written off as aid zones, women's cooperatives became industrial engines. Groups of mothers, widows, and daughters pooled their profits to buy oil presses, flour mills, and packaging machines. They created brands with pride: Golden Faso, Sahel Soul, Africa in every grain. These weren't charity projects. They were businesses. Profitable, productive, proud. Profits didn't vanish into offshore accounts. They built schools. They dug wells. They funded clinics. In one northern province, women voted to pay school fees for every girl under 16. Literacy rates among young women jumped from 45% to nearly 70% in just 5 years. This wasn't just about food. This was economic independence. Meanwhile, youth migration plummeted. Boys who once risked drowning in the Mediterranean now ran delivery trucks, managed silos, repaired processing machines. Girls ran bakeries, designed packaging, managed cooperatives. Whole communities stopped dreaming of escape and started building home. One young man, Issa, said it best: "I used to see Europe as my only future. Now, I see my future in these fields. I want to be a farmer, not a refugee." And he wasn't alone. His words echoed across a continent tired of bleeding its youth. Even in the face of a predicted drought, Burkina Faso prepared not with foreign consultants, but with village councils, radio alerts, and water conservation plans led by local engineers. Small-scale irrigation canals, funded from export profits, began crisscrossing farmland. Seed banks were built, compost systems established. It was not perfect, but it was homegrown. And homegrown solutions meant more than survival, they meant dignity. International media, once skeptical, had to adjust their tone. What they first called corn populism now appeared as grassroots governance. What they dismissed as spectacle now looked like innovation. Even European buyers, those who once tried to shut the doors, began to shift. In quiet meetings and backdoor summits, they admitted what they had once feared. If you can't stop it, you might have to join it. But the Burkina response was measured. "We will trade," said one minister, "but not on our knees." This new confidence rippled across Africa. Mali signed a maize import deal. Ghana sent a delegation to study cooperative models. Niger purchased Burkina feedstock for livestock. Senegal invited Burkina agronomists to lead trainings. Burkina Faso was no longer the student, it had become the teacher, and yet, critics remained. Environmental NGOs still warned of soil degradation. Economists forecast collapse. Some African leaders muttered that Traoré Captain Ibrahim's latest news was getting too popular, too fast. But the people stood firm. They built fences around fields, not to keep out animals, but to keep out fear. Youth patrolled granaries like soldiers. Elders taught children the value of every kernel. The old phrase, "We are what we eat," had taken on new meaning. We are what we grow. In one festival, held to celebrate the second harvest, villagers painted murals of helicopters, not as weapons, but as angels of grain. Children dressed as cornstalks. Elders told stories under mango trees about the year the sky gave back life. And across the land, a slogan emerged. From hunger to harvest, from silence to sovereignty, Burkina Faso had become the granary of the Sahel. But more importantly, it had become a mirror showing other African nations what was possible when belief met boldness, when dignity replaced dependency. Africa can do it. For years, the world looked at Burkina Faso and saw only dust, drought, and despair. But by the end of the 2020 seconds, it was no longer a question of whether Burkina Faso could survive, it was a question of whether the world could handle its rise. Because the rain of corn didn't just grow food, it grew power, and power makes people nervous. By 2029, Burkina Faso was no longer simply exporting maize. It was exporting processed goods, flour, oil, ethanol. The value chain was no longer foreign-owned. It was African-led, and that terrified the old order. Suddenly, at WTO meetings, whispers turned into warnings. New trade barriers were proposed under the guise of environmental protections. Safety certifications became more complex. Market quotas began to shift conveniently, excluding African maize. But this time, Africa pushed back. With support from partners in the Middle East and Asia, Burkina Faso lobbied back. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and India, now long-term buyers of Burkina grain, defended the country's right to export. China began discussions about helping build ethanol plants. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa openly supported agricultural sovereignty in the Sahel. This wasn't just a trade dispute. It was a geopolitical shift, and the ripple effects were unmistakable. Mali replicated the aerial seed model. Niger developed a regional maize exchange. Ghana and Senegal introduced cooperative funding laws modeled on Burkina Faso. What had started as an isolated experiment had become a continental strategy. In international media, the narrative began to split. Some outlets applauded the innovation. Documentaries were made. Headlines praised African resilience and green miracles in the Sahel. But others were less generous. European think tanks accused Traoré of creating a parallel food system that threatened global market stability. US analysts warned that Chinese involvement in West African agriculture could tilt influence away from the West. And in the shadows, old tactics returned. Burkina cooperatives reported cyber attacks on grain inventory systems. Anonymous donations flooded opposition media in Ouagadougou. Rumors spread of sabotage in rural silos. Nothing proven, but everything suspected. One Burkina journalist summed it up. When we starved, they sent cameras. When we fed ourselves, they sent warnings. But the people were unmoved. They had tasted sovereignty, and they would not spit it out. National pride surged. Across schools, murals of cornfields replaced charity posters. Children were no longer taught to dream of Paris or New York, but to build Bobo Dioulasso, to lead Ouagadougou. At the 2029 Independence Day celebration, President Traoré spoke before a crowd of thousands. We were once the forgotten, now we are the forerunners. They said we could not grow without them. But we grew, and now they fear not our failure, but our success. His words were met with thunder, but even Traoré knew the greatest test still lay ahead. Climate models now warned that the 2030 seconds would bring one of the harshest droughts in Sahelian history. Rains were expected to falter, temperatures to rise. The true weight of the revolution would be measured not in success, but in endurance. So Burkina Faso prepared. Storage facilities were expanded. Emergency seed banks stocked. Communities trained in conservation agriculture. Women's cooperatives began stockpiling food for the poorest. Youth volunteer monitored groundwater level daily. And satellite data, funded by new partnerships, tracked weather shifts in real time. No one was waiting for help. They were building resilience. One shovel, one spreadsheet, one seed at a time. Across the world, analysts finally admitted this was no longer an outlier. It was a model. Even skeptics conceded that food sovereignty, once a dream, had become a blueprint. Not just for Africa, but for any nation tired of waiting for permission to live. And so, the eyes of the world turned not to Wall Street or Brussels, but to the red soil of Burkina Faso. Would it endure? Would the golden fields hold through the drought? Or would the revolution return to dust? Only time would tell. But one thing was clear. Burkina Faso latest news was no longer about famine or failure. It was about fierce faith planted in the ground, and rising with the sun. Africa rise. What began as a gamble, 100 tons of corn falling from military helicopters, became a revolution that fed a nation, employed its youth, empowered its women, and shook the very foundation of how the world defines Africa. In less than a decade, Captain Ibrahim, latest news is no longer just about a leader. It is about a legacy. From the cracked dust of the Sahel rose a truth too bold to ignore. Africa does not need to be saved. Africa needs to be heard. And in the golden rows of corn across Burkina Faso, latest news, that voice is louder than ever. They told us Africa was too poor to feed itself. But today, Women bake bread with their own grain. Children carry lunchboxes, packed with local porridge. Schools run on revenue from maize, not foreign donors. Villages light their homes with ethanol from their own soil. The helicopters that once symbolized occupation now carry hope. They no longer drop bombs. They drop beginnings. But this is not the end. The drought is coming, and with it, the real test of endurance. Will Burkina Faso hold the line? Will this dream sown in faith, watered in sacrifice, survive nature's harshest blow? Or will the old powers, still lurking in the shadows, find a way to break the will of a nation that dared to believe? We don't know yet, but we do know this. A continent has awakened, and once the soil remembers how to grow, the people remember how to stand. So, I ask you watching from Detroit, from Atlanta, from Baltimore, was this just a miracle in the Sahel, or a message for us all? If this report unveils a hidden truth for you, don't just scroll past. Share or comment to ensure it's not buried. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thanks for coming. See you in the next video for news analysis, the truth they don't want you to know. Africa New.